I'm Alfred Perlman. I'm a railroad man, and I'd like to tell you something about our railroad and what we're doing on it. People tend to take the railroad pretty much for granted. We in the railroad business probably haven't told the story of the changing conditions in our...
I'm Phil Bell. I'm a railroad man too, and trains are in my blood. Today, railroads are telling the story of everything they do for America, right here on the All Aboard podcast. Yep, Yahoo. Welcome back. I'm Phil Bell, PB Chris, Mr. 645, your favorite highly trained rail enthusiast, back here with the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains. I want to thank everybody out there who has liked, shared, subscribed, and commented, because that's critically important. We want you to comment as we talk about a lot of railroad issues. Now, today we are coming out on Wednesday, and from now on, Wednesdays and Fridays will be the days that you will get this program at 3 p.m. each day. So Wednesdays and Fridays, look for us there. I also want to take a moment for those of you who are either watching on YouTube, Rumble, or the video portion of the podcast. Look up behind me right here. That is a picture of an Amtrak SW9 done by Doc Rico Images. Now, Doc Rico Images, the proprietor there, a man named Juan Tarico, has been a good friend of mine for a very long time. Juan was long part of the Maryland MTA's team, and he was one of their photographers and did a great job of capturing so much of what it took to actually do things like run the MARC train, the Baltimore City subway, the light rail that operates on the former Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis, and Pennsylvania in the city of Baltimore and its environs. So from time to time, we will be showing you some of the great photos that Doc Rico, Juan Tarico, has done. And so we'll also put you in touch with him in case you would like to buy some. But today we are here for an important purpose, and that is to talk about David DeBoer's book, Piggyback, and Containers, A History of Rail Intermodal on America's Steel Highway. Now, this is a terrific book. It is 178 pages long, plus an appendix, and it was copyright 1992 by Golden West Books. And you're probably wondering, Phil, why are you talking about this book today? Well, the first thing is a lot of what we have discussed here on the All Aboard podcast recently has delved into the history of a lot of what's going on today. And intermodal is so critical to what is happening in railroading in 2025, because every Class 1 rail carrier is now focused on intermodal as being the core of its growth. For a long time, the way that railroads grew was primarily through moving natural resources, so that would be your coal primarily, but also oil to a much lesser extent, but coal, grain, building materials. So I know building materials aren't technically a natural resource, but they do come from rock and aggregate and so forth. So ultimately it is a natural resource, even if it's been processed in some form or another by the time the railroad gets to be able to move it. Stone, all of those kind of things. Those were for a very long time what really drove railroad revenues. But then as time went on, a lot of things started to change. First of all, we know about the growth of pipelines for moving oil all around the country. So oil, gasolines, other petroleum-based liquids, and so forth. That's grown. Now, that hasn't taken railroads entirely out of it, of course, but it is the preferred way to move those now in 2025, regardless of the political opposition to them. Secondly, a lot of building materials, of course, those are still moving by rail, as is grain, but the big change has been coal. And whether we're talking about the Powder River Basin of coal, or we're talking about the Appalachian sources that sustained railroads like Norfolk Southern and CSX, and then before them, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Penn Central, and so on, that has fallen off significantly. Now, in the recent years, and I'd say the last 2 to 3, there has been a resurgence in export coal. So CSX, for example, is continuing to move a lot of coal on the former Chesapeake and Ohio, whereas the N&W, or Norfolk Southern, is continuing to move coal on the N&W to Virginia, where it gets loaded into boats for shipment across the ocean. However, that business is a shell of what it once was, and it is nowhere near at the level where it would be able to sustain CSX or even sustain a lot of those predecessors like the Louisville and Nashville that heavily depended upon coal as a driver of their financial results. So, what has been the opposite change at the same time? Well, it's been intermodal, and you need look no further than the next time you order something from Amazon.com. It's going to come to your house in a package. It will have moved intermodally. Now, that intermodal movement doesn't necessarily include rail, because that can include a ship that might bring a product from the Far East, and then it gets transloaded into one truck, which then moves to a warehouse and transloaded into another truck, but that is still intermodal. However, as you also know, and we talked about in one of our early episodes, which we'll also link here in the description, intermodal does not mean sex, and yes, you have to listen to it to find out why intermodal does not mean sex, and no, it's not dirty. Although maybe it is. But rail has played a significant role in this, and you can think about every time you see trailers moving on a flat car, TOFC, TOFC, or containers moving in a well car or on a flat car, going down in double stack arrangements and so on. This has shown where the growth is. And now with every Class 1 railroad looking at this, and I do see at some point some short lines starting to become more heavily involved in intermodal movement as time goes on, short lines and regionals, it was really important for us to take another look back at intermodal and the history of it. And so I was reading this great book, and I've got to tell you, it is absolutely something, even though it's copyright 1992 and does not include any of the changes that happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s, or right up until where we are in 2025. It's invaluable to help you understand how things have developed, and what they say here, what David DeBoer says, is very important. It's not like it's something super outdated. So, a little background, David DeBoer, he is a University of Michigan MBA, and he worked with the New York Central before moving on to TWA, Trans World Airlines. Later on, he worked at both the Federal Railroad Administration and the Interstate Commerce Commission before ending up with the Southern Pacific as Assistant Vice President of Intermodal. He became one of the founders of Greenbrier Intermodal, which is part of the Greenbrier companies, and Greenbrier, in this case, being the rail car builder from the Pacific Northwest. Now, what's interesting is where the story starts. And I never would have thought, when you said, hey, Phil, let's talk about the history of the intermodal business, that you'd say, oh, well, this started really on the Long Island Railroad. Now, most of you are probably thinking, Phil, the Long Island Railroad, you mean that has all those passenger trains every day? Yes, that Long Island Railroad. Let's remember, before the Long Island became America's busiest railroad in terms of the commuter trains that it moved, it was a very important freight and passenger carrier that linked Long Island with New York City. And while Long Island, technically starts on the western edge of New York City with Brooklyn and Queens both being on it, it goes a very far distance out to the east. So you had a strong agricultural community developing there that, of course, would bring its products to market, and it would use the LIRR. And what they would do is operate these so-called farmers' trains, where the farmers would put their farm wagons on flat cars, and then the Long Island Railroad would take those wagons right into New York City. And so what does that sound like? It sounds a whole heck of a lot like truckers putting their trailers on a flat car and the railroad taking them to where they need to be. So it goes back there into the 1800s. And this discussion of the Long Island Railroad and those very, very, very early origins went on to talking about a critical driver in what created today's intermodal system, which is less than carload. Now, less than carload does not just, we have less than carload, it applies to rail. Less than truckload applies to trucking. And these are simply when you have less than, as the name indicates, a full car or truckload being moved. And the best example of LTL and LCL is UPS and FedEx, because I might ship a package, it in no way, in all likelihood, it takes up the entire rail car, a box car, or even a truck trailer. So therefore you'll have other packages that are in with it. Hence you have less than truckload or less than carload. Well, less than carload was a great business for railroads, sort of. The problem with less than carloads then as now is that in addition to being able to handle and sort the rail cars themselves that carried everything that people were shipping, you needed a way to handle and sort the stuff inside the rail cars. And the railroads, while they are very good at being logistics providers, it was kind of difficult then as now in order to have the people to be able to unload all of that, what might come in on a boxcar and then reload it somewhere else. And we're talking about something as small as potentially this book being in a package, or maybe something like a trunk that could be going to college for my son or my daughter or something like that. So that's what you got to think about. And so the business became very expensive. And the Pennsylvania, so it had a lot of opportunity, but the costs were high. So both the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central came up with ways on their own that they were going to solve these problems. And it involved moving these containers, these small containers, again, the prehistoric version of the shipping containers that we see nowadays, moving on flat cars and then well cars. And they decided, you know what, we'll take it and we'll just move it at what they called a freight of all kinds rate, which meant they didn't care what was in it. Didn't matter if it was a book, it didn't matter if it was your clothes, it didn't matter what, just put all that stuff in, we'll move it at freight of all kinds rates, boom, no problem. And this worked incredibly well. So well that the the Interstate Commerce Commission came down and said, we got to put a stop to this. And they did. And so that was the end of this early effort at Intermodal. But it was developing in other places, most notably the Midwest. A variety of Midwest and the West, a variety of interurbans and streetcar operators, such as the Chicago North Shore in Milwaukee, the famous North Shore, which carried or operated the electroliners, the Chicago South Shore in South Bend, as well as another interesting carrier that you probably will never ever hear from again, the San Leandro and Hayward Electric Railway, a streetcar operator. They were looking for ways that they could move truck trailers on their railroads, and they did so successfully. And this found its way to Class 1 carriers. One of the carriers that we talk about a lot that we're actually doing a model railroad project on, the Chicago Great Western and the New York New Haven and Hartford, early Class 1 adopters, because both of those carriers did have relatively short hauls, and they were also facing a lot of competition from trucks, and therefore the ability to put a lot of those trucks on a train and move them made a lot of sense, because now they could take back some of that business that they were losing. But here was the interesting thing. As this started to grow and become something of more than just a novelty, you saw a lot of pushback from within the railroads themselves. A lot of the carriers said, hold on. The core of our business is the boxcar. That's really where most of our freight is moved, and we want to focus on the boxcar. And so that left a lot of the folks who were developing intermodal to be left to the side, so to speak, within their respective companies. And that kind of allowed a lot of this development to take place outside of the, I guess you could say, watchfulness of senior management in many cases. And I would actually think that's probably a very good thing, because in any business enterprise, once you get to the point where you're generating consistent revenues and there's growth and you have to worry about outside shareholders and so on, so it's not just you running your own business, you have a lot of shareholders and also stakeholders, which are other people in the community, your employees and so forth, that you've got to pay attention to. Oftentimes, even some of the best businesses can become very myopic in how they go about things, because they say, look, you know what? We have such a large investment in a boxcar fleet. We have such a large investment in hopper cars for coal and so on. And now you want us to change our focus to putting these truck trailers, who, oh, by the way, are operated by our competitors that we hate, on the flat cars and move them from point A to point B. What is this going to entail? Is it going to be safe, and so on? Now, all of these questions were eventually answered, and not without great difficulty. But the book shows the large universe that came together, again, probably outside of the laser focus of senior management. But it developed, and ultimately these folks were able to sell the idea not only to the senior managers themselves, and we're talking about the president, vice president of operations, vice president of mechanical, the kind of people who really are going to be closely involved in the way that things are being moved across the railroad. As well as the marketing department was so critical. In fact, anytime you're really looking to work with a railroad, you've got to understand who's in the marketing department, how they work, and how they think, because while they may not be the operating department, their words will carry a lot of weight because they're the ones who have to sell the railroad, so to speak, to the customers. And so the better that they understand and the better that they see what the benefit is to them, then the more likely it is that what you're proposing might have a way to go forward. Anyway, the book tells the story of the development, the people who were involved in the development, going from what is it going to take to just put a truck trailer on a flat car and not have it fly off, to how can we more efficiently get the trailers on and off the flat cars, what kind of trailers are available to be carried, what type of flat car will be able to carry them at a profitable rate. Because let's remember, a lot of the early activities that you see would have a small trailer on a small flat car. And you've probably seen this on a lot of model trains and thought, well, that's a nice little novelty. And you have the trailer and the flat car in between some box cars and hopper cars and so on. Well, that's actually kind of prototypical because that's the way it was early on. But that wasn't incredibly profitable because keep in mind that trailer wasn't carrying a whole heck of a lot of freight, so they were not going to be charging a high amount for it, or as much as, say, a boxcar, but you would still be putting in all the work and actually more than it would take to move a boxcar, because obviously you have to get the trailer off the ground onto the train and then off the flat car and back onto the ground again, so there's more labor involved. So we learn a lot of the different plans for intermodal service that came about, the ways that it became profitable, the people and the companies that were participating, and how it happened. And you will be surprised. It was never, ever a linear thing. There was no point at which it was understood, look, this is going to be great, it's going to be a home run. It was always nip and tuck from the beginning. And there were always questions about what was going to be the viability of it, how are we going to get there, how are we going to make it work. But you will see where it is very, very successful. And you'll learn a lot of interesting names in the rail industry, along with seeing some that you've already heard, such as Bill Brosnan, along the way. Now, the one downside to Piggyback and containers, I would say, is that I don't think DeBoer spent enough time covering some of the alternative methods that didn't work out, such as the flexi van and also the road railer. Now, it's a little bit of a stretch to say that the road railer didn't quite work out, but the road railer ultimately did, at least as of now, get confined into a relatively small number of lanes where it was easy to find backhaul for the railroad, as opposed to intermodal being TOFC, COFC, well cars, and so on, which is operated nearly everywhere on every Class 1 railroad, regardless of backhaul, because it ultimately has become more profitable. And most importantly, interchangeability. It's very easy for any railroad to move the equipment of any other railroad, whereas something like a road railer or a flexi van required specialty equipment, and that is what also made it a little bit more expensive to operate. And for those of you who are real nerds just like me, you will see in this book there are even financial tables that explain the profitability and how all this came about. So it's not just talking about it in the theoretical sense. You'll be able to actually go through and see some of the calculations done. Now, of course, as we mentioned earlier, this book ends in the early 1990s when intermodal was really important and it was hot, but it was not yet the dominant form of revenue generation at Class 1 freight railroads. So what I am doing, is recommending that you pick up a copy of Piggyback and Containers, A History of Rail Intermodal on America's Steel Highway. And it's going to be kind of tough because the book has been out of print for a while, and the copies of it that you'll find are expensive. I was very lucky, and a good friend of mine agreed to lend it to me and give me some time to get through it and, of course, do this episode. But if we ever reach our dream, which is to have our own presidential library. Yes, presidential library. Our own transportation library here at All Things Trains. I can guarantee you this will be among the the copies that we have in our collection and available to those of you out there. But that's a little bit down the railroad, so I hope this is very helpful to you. What I want you to do now is please like, share, and subscribe. We want to have you at every episode that we're putting out. Ring the bell, whether you like what I'm saying, whether you don't. If you're upset about my pen or not, I don't care, but I want you to be part of this audience, and I want you to help me spread the word of what railroads are, how they work, how they serve our country, both passenger and freight, industrial, you name it. Every facet of our lives depends on rail transportation in some form or another, and the more we know and the more we share, the better off we will have to continue to have this great mode helping to make our country strong. So we will see you down the line, and thanks for choosing the All Aboard Podcast by All Things Trains.